Most people will look at the latest UN headlines and think we are watching the end of a war. That is not the real story. The real story is that Washington and Tehran may no longer be trying to solve this war at all. They may only be trying to build something thin enough, fast enough, and politically saleable enough to stop the war from restarting next week. And that is a much more dangerous kind of diplomacy. Let me start with one fact that changes everything. The talks are no longer really aimed at a full peace settlement. They have shrunk, and Iranian negotiators have reportedly scaled back from a comprehensive deal and are now seeking a temporary memorandum to prevent a return to conflict. That single shift changes how you should read almost every optimistic headline coming out of this week. Because once peace becomes a memorandum, the question changes. The question is no longer whether Washington and Tehran have finally resolved the core dispute. The question becomes whether both sides can build a narrow enough bridge to get through the ceasefire window without falling back into bombing, blockade, retaliation, and oil shock. That is not peace. That is containment. And containment is always more fragile than it looks when politicians start talking like a breakthrough is near. Now put a second fact next to the first one. Donald Trump says that if a deal is signed in Islamabad, he may go there himself. That sounds like a flourish. It is not just a flourish. It tells you the diplomacy may already be moving into what I would call endgame compression. Endgame compression is what happens when a war reaches a point where the real disputes are still too large to solve, the timeline is too short to solve them cleanly, and the political need for a visible ending becomes stronger than the practical ability to produce one. So the negotiation starts compressing. The final settlement becomes an interim document. The hard issues get pushed into a second stage. The battlefield calm gets sold as diplomatic momentum, and the possible signing scene starts to matter almost as much as the unresolved substance underneath it. That is the shape of this moment. Because if Trump is already talking about Islamabad as the place where a deal could be signed, then the negotiation is no longer only about uranium, sanctions, or Hormuz. It is also about staging. It is about who gets to stand at the table. It is about who gets to say the war ended. It is about who owns the image of the ending. And once a war's ending starts turning into a political event before the core terms are fully settled, you have to start reading every sign of progress much more carefully. Look at the actual disputes still on the table. The United States wants Iran to halt enrichment for far longer than Iran wants. Iran wants a shorter freeze, access to frozen funds, and sanctions relief. The future of highly enriched uranium is still unresolved. There are indications that part of the stockpile could go to a third country, but not necessarily all of it. And the Strait of Hormuz is still part of the bargain, because maritime access, oil flows, and economic oxygen are now tied directly into the diplomacy. That means this is not one clean nuclear negotiation. It is a bundle. Nuclear limits, uranium storage, sanctions relief, shipping access, ceasefire timing, political sellability. Every one of those issues has its own logic. Every one of them can poison the others. And the more unresolved files you compress into one interim arrangement, the easier it becomes to produce a document that sounds like progress and behaves like a delay. That is the deeper danger here, because a temporary memorandum can do three things at the same time. It can stabilize the battlefield, it can calm markets, and it can conceal how little of the underlying dispute has actually been solved. That is why the oil market reaction matters so much. Oil fell on Friday on optimism that the war could be nearing some kind of diplomatic off-ramp. Brent fell to roughly $98 a barrel and U.S. crude to about $93. That tells you traders are responding to the possibility of a narrower short-term de-escalation. But the market is not exactly screaming confidence either. Prices are still elevated. The conflict has already disrupted enormous volumes moving through Hormuz. And what matters now is not just whether a document gets signed. What matters is whether the market starts believing the war is actually being unwound or merely paused, because those are very different things. A real unwinding would mean the dispute is being resolved. A pause would mean the dispute is being managed. And managed disputes have a habit of returning under worse conditions than the ones in which they were frozen. Now add one more piece. While the White House has sounded upbeat about the prospects of a deal, and said Pakistan has emerged as the only mediator, the Pentagon has sounded like a government preparing for the exact opposite outcome. Pete Hegseth said the blockade is the polite version of what this could become. He said, "Us forces are locked and loaded on Iran's dual use infrastructure, remaining power generation, and energy industry if ordered." That is not background noise. That is the hidden structure around the talks. On one side, diplomacy is being narrowed into a temporary memorandum. On the other side, the coercive menu is being widened beyond the nuclear file into the economic functioning of the Iranian state itself. That combination tells you everything. It tells you the United States is not negotiating from a place of trust. It is negotiating from a ladder of pressure, and when diplomacy sits inside a pressure ladder like that, every interim deal becomes vulnerable to the same basic problem. If the other side believes the memorandum is only a staging point for the next demand, then even a signed pause can remain psychologically unstable from day one. That is why people who hear the words, "we are close to a deal," and assume the hardest part is over may be reading this moment backward. The hardest part may be exactly what has not been solved yet. The harder part is not producing a piece of paper. The harder part is producing a piece of paper that both sides can survive politically after the cameras leave. Iran cannot easily sell permanent surrender after war. Washington cannot easily sell a deal that looks weak after blockade and airstrikes. Trump cannot easily talk like victory is close and then settle for something that looks like managed ambiguity. And Tehran cannot easily accept a framework that feels like the war only stops for 60 days while the next pressure campaign is already being prepared. That is the political geometry of this moment. Everyone may want the war not to restart immediately. That does not mean they agree on what its ending should actually look like. In fact, the opposite may be true. It may mean they disagree so fundamentally about the ending that the only thing available right now is a temporary structure to postpone another round of conflict. That is why Pakistan matters more than people think. Pakistan is no longer just a room. It is becoming the room in which an ending may be staged before the ending is truly settled. That makes Islamabad more than a venue. It makes Islamabad part of the political architecture of the war's possible pause. And once the venue becomes part of the architecture, optics begin to matter more. A deal signed in silence is one thing. A deal signed in Islamabad with Trump potentially appearing in person is something else entirely. That is not just diplomacy. That is diplomatic theater built around a compressed endgame. And diplomatic theater can help force momentum. It can also tempt everyone involved to oversell what has actually been achieved. There is another reason to be cautious. The war around Iran is no longer just the Iran file. Lebanon had to quiet down. Shipping has to be discussed. Oil markets are watching every sentence. Energy importers across Asia are still exposed. And the blockade remains in place even while the administration says it feels good about the prospects of a deal. That means the diplomacy is being carried out under conditions of ongoing coercion, regional spillover, and market fragility. That is not the setting in which durable peace is usually born. It is the setting in which stopgap arrangements are born. Stopgap arrangements matter. Sometimes they prevent something far worse. Sometimes the choice is not between a perfect peace and a flawed one. Sometimes the choice is between an imperfect pause and another week of strikes. If that is the real choice now, then a memorandum could be extremely important. But if it is important precisely because it is smaller than peace, smaller than settlement, smaller than resolution, smaller than the rhetoric now surrounding it. And that is the point. The smaller the agreement, the easier it is to reach, the more likely it is that the biggest unresolved issues are simply being moved into the next room. So what should you watch next? Watch whether officials keep talking about momentum while avoiding the phrase final deal. Watch whether the uranium question moves toward partial removal instead of total removal. Watch whether sanctions relief, maritime access, and nuclear limits keep getting bundled into one stopgap package. Watch whether the rhetoric around Islamabad grows more theatrical before the actual terms become clearer. And above all, watch whether Washington keeps talking about peace while preparing openly for a wider war on Iranian infrastructure if the talks fail. Because the real story is not that a deal may be close. The real story is that the ending of this war may already be shrinking into something both sides hope is just strong enough to postpone the next round. It is not even the same thing as resolution. It is a compressed endgame, a memorandum, a political signing scene, a delay wrapped in the language of progress. And if that is what this moment really is, then the most dangerous mistake is to confuse a possible pause with the actual settlement of the war.